Here's how I design a fantasy city from scratch. I like to start with what I already know. This is a relatively important settlement. Level 4 out of 5 in my perception. If you want more in-depth discussion of settlement levels, check out my video on settlements specifically. It's by a major land border, sits in the mountains, and has a river nearby. While making my country map, I also determined that this place would likely house some sort of ancient beacon used to signal enemy movements, and a north-facing fort for reconnaissance. As this is a mountainous settlement, I began with a physical barrier of a cliff. This helps divide up your workload while providing a clear place to begin. I like to start with physical barriers, so I also put in some water soon. First, though, is something I know needs to be present. A brazier beacon-type lighthouse on the southern cliff, a grand and imposing structure. This helps set up the beginnings of a flow to the city. Main thoroughfares will tend to move towards major landmarks, for example. Next, I included a waterfall, moving across the cliff top. All cities need some way to get water, and I thought I'd incorporate a mountain spring into this city. I decided that an underground lake under a grand hill would make for a fascinating backdrop, and provide some mystique to the people who live atop the rise, presumably royalty or nobility. So, I developed this rocky outcropping into its own space before filling in surrounding cliff faces and placing a set of stairs beside the beacon, setting up the beginnings of a major road. Next, I put in another of my prerequisites, a northern fort used for spying on enemy movements in the valley below. Blocking in the walls first, I added a few buildings before including a small bluff out to the top, a potential dock for airships, or a potential brutal military execution place. Moving to the water-giving rock outcrop, I decided to lean into the theme of a single water source, seeming blessed. Much like at Lord, I decided that there should be buildings of significance around this solitary spring. I decided to use a palatial walled complex to demonstrate the power of those who live here, splitting it into a public palace and a private one, much like some Chinese traditions. Indeed, I drew pagoda-style roofs for these buildings and placed a selection of natural life around to create a symbolic place of peace and rest. Furthermore, I added a barracks to the outer walls, after adding some buttresses. Next, I placed the cliffs around the rise, leaving space for a single staircase cut into the stone. After adding a few miscellaneous buildings and tidying up the cliffs and walls, I start on the surroundings of this sacred stream. First, a bridge. This helps create our through line, a main thoroughfare across the city. Use landmarks and bridges to guide where your streets go. After all, people want to go to landmarks, and they need to cross bridges. Adding a wall to protect the beacon seems wise, and now I develop a small district in the shadow of the palace. This will include temples and sacred sites, being something of a residential/temple district, perhaps with a guest house or two for weary pilgrims. I like to add inconsequential structures just as little boxes and squares, with no roof detail, and try to bunch them in clusters, although no more than usually 3 boxes deep, to ensure that they are accessible for the people who live there. Whoops, I guess I'm bored of inconsequential boxes. Let's draw a square where the stairs from the clifftop palace join the city. Choke points and convergences of many streets are excellent candidates for a civic centre, often with a market, fountain, statue, landmark, or some important building involved. I like to leave 4 to 5 exits to any square to create branching paths and diverse routes throughout the city. I sketched a few paths very lightly to give myself an idea of reasonable routes throughout the settlement. Sorry if you can't see them, you'll see them later and you'll definitely see their influence. Before making a small warehouse at the waterfall's base, adding a crane to help lift up or down any goods too big or too bulky to travel by stairs. A few more warehouses by the top of the crane and we return to our residential shrine district. Some small houses later and I need to decide on the surroundings of my fortified hill. I decided to use a forested area. Natural boundaries are a very good way to break up space and to take up space on your map. To draw a forest, I usually employ these fuzzy, almost cloud-like borders, and occasionally bring them inwards. Placing a few groves helps make it look better and more interesting. Next, I added a garden/patio to what I decided was a tavern in the main square, and then a small isolated pagoda out in the forest glade. I try and fit in houses when I can, just little boxes for when my mind is doing something else. Doing it a bit at a time breaks up the tedium of all of these little houses. Next, a road to connect the lookout fort to the beacon. A logical step. This road would need to be fast, clear, and straight. In a time with fewer buildings, and perhaps less magic. Connecting this to the main square is another logical step. This helps establish the significant routes, and a place of commonality in between. For this, I decided that the historical need to get messages from fort to beacon meant a stable would have been useful. I assumed the fort had its own, but a stable of fresh horses is a great defensive measure. With the inevitable crowding of the streets and space though, perhaps this stable has become a tavern, using its central position to serve as a melting pot for citizens travelling to the fort, the warehouses, the temple, or indeed the main square. Main roads tend to have larger civic buildings and shops along them, so I just dotted a few in here. The settlement looks quite bunched. How about a smaller settlement up by the fort? Much of this may be the garrison, but garrison needs places for their partners and or children to be, with commerce and education of at least some degree. Small villages often spring up surprisingly close to major settlements, although in the modern world many of these have been swallowed in urban sprawl. A small village outside the fort, then, with enough amenities to reasonably sustain itself. Let's plot out our major roads and streets. These almost never end up straight, so make sure to include a dogleg or two for that medieval-ish authenticity. For filling in the space between and behind main roads, just remember no more than 3 houses deep, usually, and try to pay attention so that you don't draw yourself into a labyrinth, unless that's what you're going for. A few small houses later, yes, they are literally how I waste time in between major choices, we move on to an opposite area to the old stable, just outside the beacon. This would likely end up as a town square due to its centrality and links as a location, but I decided that since the big fountain square seems a little well kept and pompous, this would be the perfect place for this settlement's market, and I chose to use a covered one. Tents, fabrics and pillars holding the whole thing up. On top of a mountain, it's a risky choice, but I imagine the beacon's walls probably give some shelter, as well as the Great Rock. I imagine that this whole settlement may have a pervasive scent of tea and spice, a fine dust scattered across the wind, causing the walls to glitter with spices due to the cliff-top winds, especially with the Chinese-ish influenced palace on top of the Great Hill. And now, filling out more of the settlement. There's no use having a town square if there's no buildings around it. But I couldn't think of anything to place nearby for now, so I moved elsewhere. Another landmark, a small shrine which I decided to bury in a natural space, another forest. Only I didn't want to erase the lovely border of my southern forest, so instead I left them split. This left me with another issue though. What could possibly have split this forest? I already have a river, which is supposed to be the only one in the city. So, in doubt, include an interesting natural feature. It's fantasy, after all. A great crevice splitting the land makes for an interesting contrast to this tea-loving, shrine-going lookout city. So, occupied with the defence of the land to its borders, they neglect the Earth's risks. Furthermore, I decided to spread this crevice across the mountaintop. Perhaps some disaster ruined the original settlement line and has forced them to rebuild. Nonetheless, People get about their lives, so a bridge or two to get where they need to go seems reasonable. Adding in a few risky or ruined buildings helps to sell the danger of this crevice further, and a few finishing touches to the city's sprawl later, I added some natural features below the cliffs. Lastly, a few small tips for lining your beautiful new map with a pen. I tend to give precedence to anything which blocks the natural course of movement. Water, forests and walls mainly. I like to partially line large terrain features to avoid just big clumps of black lines. It really helps give a bit of artistry to your work while ensuring your big terrain pieces like cliffs pop off the page without dominating everything. Big structures are next, and by big, I literally mean big, but also important. I try to just outline the exterior roofs and perhaps the central roof peak. Doing all the little lines can look very messy. Less is more when it comes to lining. I tend to line my trees, ponds and smaller natural features to keep consistency between marking forests and rivers. A final tip, after marking the final finishing touches to your natural features and your buildings of importance, is to move along your major roads and thoroughfares, not following them fully, but leaving gaps, much like we did with the cliffs, to break it up and make it look lovely. And with that, you have a fantasy city, filled with logical choices, interesting natural features, a burgeoning identity, and a significant vibe and potential for historical development. Where did the Great Crevice come from? Where exactly is the water coming from? And is it as holy as they say it is? What secrets may the covered market hold for our adventurers? And will it perhaps interfere in the path to light the beacon with its great sprawling tents and market stalls? In any case, these questions will be answered when you get this map in front of your players. And having created it in less than an hour, you're ready to go. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video and can get to drawing your own fantasy maps by hand, especially if you haven't before. It's a wonderfully cathartic experience. If you've enjoyed yourself, please leave me a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more like this. But for now, I'm Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master, and I'll see you in the next one.